Disney's new live-action remake of Snow White was hit with problems from the very beginning, and its problems have only grown since its release. In many ways, it seemed set up to fail, and was never able to overcome the various hurdles in its way. Many fingers are being pointed at star Rachel Zegler, but the real problems with the film are much deeper. So how does this film actually compare to the original? And what really went wrong with this version of Snow White's story? Let's take a closer look. This modern update to Snow White is of course based on the beloved 1937 film, which itself was plagued with controversy and problems during its production, to the point that producers were calling it Disney's folly before it even came out.
He didn't know if it would really work. Well, if people don't buy this, this will just fall flat, and then I will be done.
That film, however, overcame its obstacles and went on to become an iconic piece of animation and cinema history. This remake, it seems, is unfortunately not so lucky. While some do break through and find success, audiences have by and large become tired of Disney's more recent live-action remakes. As the company has continued to produce more and more live-action versions of their beloved classics, the fact that these adaptations exist solely to be a cash grab has felt more and more apparent. Of course, every movie studio wants to make money on their films and shows, but it started to feel more like Disney is betting less on its magic and talent and more on name and nostalgia alone. This has led to each new adaptation being met not with excitement, but with, at best, trepidation, and sometimes outright anger. Snow White was no different. That Disney was finally planning to do a live-action version of its first ever animated feature didn't come as a shock, but was met with concerns. The original film has long been met with complaints about its story, both warranted and not, which we'll dig into in a moment. And so there were worries about what might be changed in the update. The first shockwave of backlash, though, came at the casting of the very talented Rachel Zegler, won a Golden Globe for her turn as Maria in Steven Spielberg's 2021 adaptation of West Side Story. Then there was also the question of the dwarves. Dwarves have a long history in folklore and haven't always been connected to the idea of being short. In fact, many older versions don't really mention their statures at all, and many were indeed shapeshifters. But the dwarves of Snow White have been specifically connected to dwarfism in the public consciousness, especially as they became more central to the story. They were unnamed in the original Grimm's fairy tale, but became more fleshed out and specific characters in the 1912 Broadway adaptation of the story, which was made into a silent film in 1916. Then, with the 1937 Disney film, they were really pulled into the story as major characters, and in fact were apparently initially planned to be the focal point of the story.
Great thing about the dwarfs in Snow White is that they are definite, individual characters with special personalities.
Dwarfs' names fit their personalities.
After a few on-set photos dropped, people worried that the 7 dwarves had been removed from the story entirely. But it turned out that those characters were just the newly introduced bandit group, and the dwarves were still in the picture, just as Uncanny Valley CGI. The choice to still go ahead with making a new version of the film featuring these stereotype-laden characters, but then also not even give the roles to actors who already have so few parts available to them, definitely ruffled some feathers.
This is a role made for me and our community. I can't be Superman or Spider-Man or Captain America. I can be one of the 7 dwarves.
But even given all of that, fans knew that the original picture also faced a lot of obstacles and pitfalls before its premiere, and it turned out to be great. So there was still hope. Snow White 2025 unfortunately did not manage to overcome its issues, though. This new version of Snow White is in many ways a combination of so many of the worst parts of modern remakes. The script seems to simultaneously desire to add so much new lore, while also then essentially having to speedrun the actual plot to fit in all of the new characters and information. This means that nothing and no one ends up feeling like it gets the development needed to be engaging. Take Jonathan, the updated take on the original movie's prince, a character with so little development that he didn't even get a name. It's great that this film gives Jonathan more of a story, more stake in the world, and at least some connection to Snow White, but because the film also wanted to add so many other characters, like those bandits who don't really seem to have any purpose for existing within the story, he still doesn't really end up feeling like a very deeply drawn character by the end. And the attempt to flesh out the backstory of everything from the original film can even backfire in that, instead of feeling like it's filling out this world, it just leaves us with more questions. In its attempt to be everything, it ends up being a lot of nothing much of the time. Much of this drive to flesh out the lore of the stories comes from a desire to make them feel more realistic and relatable to our modern world, which to a degree does make sense. If you're going to make a new version of something, you might as well update it. But because these updates aren't done out of a care for the story and bringing it into our era in a genuine way, while still holding on to what made it work in the first place, it often falls flat. As the budgets for these live-action remakes have ballooned, the actual outcomes have not seemed to benefit all that much from the extra cash. Clocking in with a budget of over $200 million, one might expect the film to be particularly extravagant and dazzling. But that's not really the case. The costumes are one of the most immediately apparent examples of this. They look more like mass-market Halloween costumes than high-quality film costumes. And to be clear, this is not the result of some lack of skill on the part of the costume designer, Sandy Powell. Powell has created amazing looks for films from Orlando to Velvet Goldmine to Carol to the 2015 Cinderella remake and beyond. She very clearly knows how to create great costuming that evokes character, time, place, and mood. But unfortunately, we don't get to see any of that talent on the screen in Snow White. The money could also be going to all of the CGI and VFX used on the film. And surely that did cost a pretty penny, in the same way that animating the original film almost bankrupted Walt.
We had the family fortune, we had everything wrapped up in Snow White. In fact, the banker, I think, was losing more sleep than I was.
But here too, the live-action version seems to fall flat. It can't seem to capture the lightness and whimsy of the original, and doesn't quite make up for it with anything else. But to be fair, the 1937 film was a technical masterpiece, so it would be hard for any film to live up to that. But that's the thing about remakes. As we're watching, we'll always be comparing it to that original. Snow White as a character has often run into a problem we've talked about before in regards to another Disney princess, Cinderella. It's perfectly fine and justified to look back on older media with a critical lens, and be aware of the biases and thought patterns that might have led to certain choices, and how all of that can then go on to impact people in the real world and how they view themselves and others. But there has been a tendency to boil these two specific characters' entire stories down to just, girl waits around to be saved by a guy. Even though that's not really what happens. As we've discussed before with Cinderella, this totally erases the reality that she's a young woman trying to figure out how to survive in and escape from an abusive household. And she doesn't even care about the prince at all. He just happens to be at a party she wanted to go to on her one night off. Snow White finds herself in a similar situation, trapped under the thumb of a wicked stepmother who is intensely jealous of her and thus wishes to destroy her. Snow White has to deal with a lot, especially given the fact that she's only around 14. So it's not surprising that she doesn't yet have the full, confident sense of self that would allow her to immediately fight back. And it also makes the fact that she's enamored with the idea of a prince make a lot more sense. And sure, she has to be saved by a prince in the end, but she's literally in a coma that her abusive parent put her in. And while it is the prince's kiss that breaks the spell, it's the entire community she's built that really comes to her rescue. With the live-action remake, there was an idea that they were going to update this character for the modern day and give her more agency. And that certainly could have worked. There have been a number of modern takes on Snow White's story that engage with her character choices and arc from different angles, from Snow White and the Huntsman to Mirror Mirror and beyond. But here, instead of giving her agency as a character, they've instead seemingly just started her out at the end of her character journey, which takes away from her the ability to actually learn and grow over the course of the story. This seems to come from a misunderstanding of what it means for a female character to be strong. We've got a whole video on that you can check out next. Assuming that to be strong means that she can never show anything that could be construed as weakness. Here, Snow White is ready and willing to stand up for herself and what's right from the jump, totally unafraid. This makes sense to some degree, since it is after all Snow White's inherent good-heartedness that makes her the fairest of the land. But because she's so unfailingly confident from pretty much the beginning, it feels like she has nowhere to grow as a character. Zegler does bring a brightness to the role that helps us forget about some of the problems, and though most of the songs in the film are nothing to write home about, of course she brings vocals to everyone she's in. But now, even after its release, the film has continued to stumble. Though it opened at number 1 on its first weekend out, the film was not received well. There was of course the backlash from the people who were going to hate on it no matter what. But unfortunately, it also disappointed fans and people who were willing to give it a shot. Gross plunged for the film's second weekend, and things don't seem to be picking back up. The reviews for the film were pretty mediocre to bad across the board, but then it also got hit by a wave of negative review bombing that was so intense that IMDb had to put up a disclaimer about it. Many have been quick to point the finger at star Rachel Zegler for the failure, saying that her being too outspoken and not pale is the cause of all the film's troubles. But as we've laid out, that's not the case. The problems with this film come from the House of Mouse itself, and its desire to squeeze the last drop of profit out of everything it can get its hands on with no interest in things like creativity or care or fun. If the company continues to be able to brush off its own poor choices and hide behind whichever new star it's decided to bring on board to use as a shield, things will never change. It's unfortunate that $200 million could have gone to making multiple great, new, inspired, interesting films, starring all kinds of characters and telling all kinds of new stories, but instead was thrown away on yet another lifeless, lazy cash grab. And if we want to have any hope of Hollywood changing its ways, it's important that we point out the real problem with this lazy IP recycling. It may not be a happily ever after for Snow White, but maybe it can begin pushing Hollywood towards something better. Is there a fairy tale or story from folklore that has never been turned into a film, animated or live action, that you think would be really cool to see on screen? If so, let us know what it is, and if you think it would work better, animated or live action. That's The Take. Click here to watch the video we think you'll love, or here to check out a whole playlist of awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.